Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Speaker Maximize series. I'm Mandy Bass, the founder of Free Speaker Bureau. This week, we got some great feedback from the last program, Get Booked, Get Paid, and that's where I talked about getting gigs and the various ways that you can monetize what you're doing, your speaking opportunities. Today, we're going to focus on tweaks to your presentation that can help you get better results from your communication in general and from your speaking, from your presentations specifically. Then the next session that we're going to do next week is going to be around practicing, around remembering, structuring your practice, uh, stru- uh, practicing your communication, and how to be able to. A lot of times, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, I was asked to do a Dharma talk at my Zen group, and the talk that I wanted to give was going to be very different from what I would normally do in a presentation. So it was something that I was just going to do one time. And I managed to go there, do a little bit of practicing, and I was able to do the entire talk without ever having a note. And so that makes a really big difference, whether, having a presentation, having something in front of you versus in a live presentation, really being able to connect and speak to the audience. And a number of people commented how great it was that I was able to do the whole entire talk and not have any single note in front of me. So I wanted, the next time I'm going to show you what some of my tricks are in order to help you do that. But first, we want to talk about your actual presentation itself, how to make it really good, really juicy in terms of grabbing people's attention and then influencing them, motivating them to go in the direction that you want to lead. So today we will talk about 5 of my favorite strategies to cut through the noise, grab attention, and get people to take action. And I just want to say here, before we really get into the presentation itself, is that the format in which you are communicating is really important in deciding how you're going to go about taking notes or uh, giving or presenting a PowerPoint. I would never, ever, ever use a PowerPoint in a live presentation unless it was a workshop or a sort of 2-day retreat or 5-day retreat or something like that. And even then, when I do a 5-day program, I'm very careful about when I'm going to use a PowerPoint and when I'm not. I'm doing it here because when we have video, as many of you know who do webinars, that really creates a strain on people's bandwidth. And a lot of times, what happens is that you have more problems as regards people being able to see and access the presentation. It's great afterwards, but even so, the timing of the audio and the video is a little bit off. So, my preference when I do a webinar like this, just to give people something to look at and something visually interesting, is to create slides. But typically, if I was doing an hour, hour and a half presentation, I would not have slides with me. So that's just my style. And the reason that I don't tend to have PowerPoint in live presentations is because those PowerPoints tend to distract attention, tend to take people's attention, and then they're not focused on you. So that's why I like to create a real bond between myself and the members of the audience. And it depends on how many people are in the audience, what the setup is. If you're going to be on a stage that's very far removed physically from those people in the audience, and that's different. You have to take all those things into account. But typically, if I'm speaking to a group of anything 100 or less, my rule of thumb is to have as much interaction um, with them as possible. Okay, so that being said, um, in today's presentation, we're going to talk about communication skills. And communication is a learned skills. Many of you are really good at it very naturally. But just like learning to play the piano or learning golf or tennis or a new sport, even if you have the natural ability, there's always more to learn. And even when you've done all the head learning possible, you can improve by tweaking and practicing. Really, the difference between an amateur and a professional is that an amateur gets to a place where they feel like they're as good as they need to be, as good as they want to be. But a professional always continues to learn and to practice and to find ways to improve and perfect their craft. And so, you know, I constantly am trying to improve and learn new techniques, find out new things, and very importantly, practice them and get feedback from other people to see if they're working or not. Because sometimes we're in our own little space and we don't really know how things are being perceived. So it's really good to be able to get feedback from your peers, get feedback from a professional when you try something new. As I mentioned, the email I sent out, we're not going to do any sales pitches or offers today. And, so that's not what this webinar is about. It is just to try to help you improve and take your presentation up a notch. So you've taken the time, I've taken the time to pull this together for you. I would love to have 100% of your attention. So if you haven't already done so, please close your email, turn off your cell phone, and get some notes. Take some notes. Now, as I said to you in the last time, my way of taking notes is to divide the page into 3 areas. One where you're going to take notes about this specifically, then have a little section to ask me anything that comes up during the presentation. You can jot down on a little area so that when we get to the Q&A at the end, you've got those questions handy and you won't forget any of them. And then I also like to create at the bottom of the page, or really it could be anywhere, the idea section where when we talk about certain things and it triggers something that you want to do with maybe your description of your talk or an email or something where you get an idea to do something, then put it in a separate section. And that way, when we get off the call today, you can grab that information and go put it somewhere on your action list so that you will remember to actually do it rather than finding your notes in a year from now and going, oh, yeah, I remember I was going to do blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's my recommended way for breezing through an informational webinar or live presentation, and it seems to work very well for me. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what your goals should be and what the goal of this presentation is really about. The Pareto principle says, and I've found this to be true, that when you go into a room, 20% of the people are going to like you no matter what you do. So you're just the fact that you're there, and when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Some people are going to think that you do a great job no matter really what you do when you get in front of a room. And there's going to be another 20% who won't like you no matter what you do. And really, it's those 60% in the middle that you have to work with. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about here today. We're not going to even bother with the 20% who like you or who don't like you, no matter what. We want to work with that 60% in the middle that you have the possibility of influencing, that, that they're up for grabs. And what we're looking for as we go through and improve our communication skills is consistent progress, not necessarily perfection. Because as soon as we get to a place where we think we're perfect, then something tends to happen, and we find out that we're not. But if we're constantly making progress, that's what we want to work towards. So the problem we want to solve today is that many people are really walking around distracted. I know that I'm probably one of them. I mean, we're in a world, we have so many distractions. We're under constant attack from things competing for our attention. In fact, as many of you already know, human beings process 400 billion bits of information a second. And that is a lot of information for us to process and to decide what it is we're going to pay attention to. Now, often people think that when people consider something important, that they're going to be automatically and naturally attending to it. But that's not necessarily so. A few nights ago, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was like this flash, and I woke up. My internal alarm had gone off, reminding me that it was the last day of the month. And I could feel the adrenaline just pumping through my body. I remembered that I had this really important tax document that I had to get in the mail that day, or I was going to get a big penalty from the IRS, and I had a full day of appointments ahead of me. I don't know. Has that ever happened to you? Have you been in a situation where there was something that you really needed to get done, and all of a sudden you remember, oh my gosh, it's today. The day is today. And it had just been the furthest thing from your mind. It wasn't that it wasn't important. It was just that I had started on the project a couple months previously. I'd gotten distracted, and I had just left it, and I didn't put it back on my action list. I didn't, I just forgot about it. Nevertheless, that day I had a full day. I finally got time to pull that document together. It was almost time for the post office to close by the time I got it finished. And I jumped in my car going to the post office, and I realized I'd been such a rush that day to get back home to get that tax document done that I hadn't stopped to get gas. And now I see that my gas tank is empty and my light is starting to flash. So I go to the gas station, I look for my wallet, and my wallet is gone. I cannot find my wallet anywhere. I rush back home, look everywhere for my wallet. I can't find my wallet. And then I remembered that the night before I had my wallet in the car. I'd put it like in this console in between the two front seats. And when I had gone to the gym, and I don't think I locked the door. I don't think I locked the car. So I was convinced that my wallet was stolen. So here I am. I'm running out of time. I'm running out of time. I've got to get this thing in the mail. My car is out of gas. I have no money. I have no credit cards. I live alone. And I've just got a few minutes to get to the post office. And that's when I remembered that I have this piggy bank. It's really a bottle, like a bottle that I've made a little hole in, where every day, because my wallet doesn't have a space for change, and every day I empty my purse and I put my change into the piggy bank. Well, luckily, it's just amazing when you start to make these little deposits that you're not even realizing how much money you can collect. So, that's what some of these techniques are like. You can go and get them, you use them, you deposit them, you learn more and more and more skills. And when you really need them, you're able to, it's just like having a piggy bank like I had that day. So, um, the thing about understanding your audience is that they're under this constant barrage or attack of things competing for their attention. And we need to go into these situations fully understanding with complete empathy where they're at so that we're able to get their attention. Sometimes we go into situations and we're just so busy thinking about what it is that we're going to say that we forget to go to people's bus stop. Those of you who've done Speaking Fortunes know I love talking about how we need to go to people's bus stop and invite them on the bus before we can take them to where we want to go. So that's the kind of thing that you've got to do. So the problem is that most people are thinking about whatever it is that they're thinking about. So, as a speaker, you have to break through their internal dialogue and penetrate their filters. And as most of you know, you probably know more in terms of this type of a thing than most groups, but you know that people see things, everybody is seeing the same situation differently. It's all about perception, right? And so everybody is coming into your presentation with their specific set of beliefs, their specific set of experiences. And typically, your presentation is going to fulfill whatever the beliefs have, whatever the experiences they have had, whatever their perception is. They're going to filter out what you're saying and what you're not saying to naturally to somehow create a presentation or to see your presentation from a perspective that is uniquely theirs, but is not necessarily what you are presenting. And everybody has their own internal processes and styles, some of them I'm going to talk to you about today, that you also have to break through. And so the first step in communication is really about getting people into a mental and emotional state of openness where they're actually able to hear what you're saying and see things from your point of view. I had a very, very dear friend of mine who had colon cancer, and a few years ago, when she had been diagnosed and was getting treated, she was telling me that she went to her doctor and well, the actual oncologist wasn't her doctor. And she was describing the scene about how she was sitting across this big table. He was in his white lab coat and he was sitting across this table. She had her husband and her brother on either side of her. And the physician was giving her the bad news that she had stage 4 cancer. And she told me that she was sitting there and she could see his mouth moving, and she could feel herself holding on to the hands of her husband and her brother on either side of her, but that she couldn't hear anything that was being said. And it wasn't until she actually got into the car that her brother related to her what had been said in that office. She said she couldn't hear it. It was just like everything was in slow motion, and the guy was just talking in the sort of monotone voice that she could sort of hear the tone, but she couldn't hear the content. So, our first step in communication is always making sure that people are open and that they're able to actually hear what we're saying and to see things from their point of view. We have to break through their filters. So, today I want to talk about finishing touches and tweaks to your existing presentation so that you can have more impact. Now, I'm saying this because there's some of you that are just starting out or that haven't begun to really develop your signature talk. We have a lot of very experienced people here online today, but we also have a few people that are really new to doing any kind of speaking. And so for those of you that are brand new, my recommendation is that you begin with the framework that we talk about in Speaking Fortunes. Now, Speaking Fortunes really helps you really build out your funnel, and it helps you figure out what your audience is like. It's very sort of an audience centric focus, and how can you maximize your speaking opportunities. But in module 4, I talk about structuring your talk. I think it's module 4. And in there, if you're just new, I want you to start there, and then later you can apply these techniques. For those of you who are really experienced or who already have at least the framework of your talk done, you can start applying these techniques right away. And the reason I say that is because, first, what I'm going to talk about today is sort of some structural things that can really make a story or make your presentation easier to remember, more interesting, more compelling in a live presentation. But first, you have to have the presentation. You have to know what you're going to talk about. If you get too stuck into the detail of some of this to begin with, you'll never get your actual talk done. You'll just be tweaking and tweaking and tweaking all the time. So first, get the basic structure of your core message, what you want to say with your 3 supporting points or 4 supporting points, depending on how long your talk is. And then you can apply these strategies after you've done that foundational work. So my 5 favorite strategies to capture and keep attention is storytelling. And I'm going to get into how to structure your stories so that they're more interesting in a moment. When we could also talk about open and nested loops, a little bit about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language patterns. And then we're going to discuss a couple of my favorite motivational traits, my favorite motivational language patterns when speaking. There's actually 6 of them, but I'm going to talk about 2 of them today because they're the most the easiest to adopt in a one-to-many presentation. And we'll also talk about incorporating 4 learning styles, which is probably more important when you're doing a workshop than necessarily a 20-minute or a half an hour introductory talk, but it's still important to capture people's attention. You don't need to use each and everything that I'm going to be sharing with you today. Just pick 1 or 2 things to integrate at a time. And then after you've practiced that, gotten feedback that you're comfortable with it, that it feels natural to you, then you can come back, look at your notes, and add something new. So you've always got something to work for. The principles that I'm going to share work for all forms of communication, not just speaking. So they're going to work if you're doing an email, if you're creating a blog post, if you're writing an article. They're going to work if you're speaking to a client or your boss or a teenager, a kid, it doesn't really matter. These principles apply to everything. But again, of course, I'm going to relate them specifically to speaking. So take notes and think about the possibilities for how and where you can use some of these strategies. So make sure you have an ideas section, however you're taking notes right now, that you can put things down. Because a lot of times what needs most improvement is your bio, your description of your talk. And sometimes people have a really great talk, but their description of it is not all that great. So make sure that you apply these strategies to those things too. So let's talk first about storytelling. What makes stories interesting? So I'd like to get some of your feedback. What makes stories interesting? Okay, so some of you say if it's an interesting story, being relatable. Okay, yes, those are all great ways to make stories interesting. When most, not rambling, okay? When most people think about communication, they think about the words that we use. But if you really think about this, we've been communicating since the day we were born, right? And we've done a pretty good job of it. There was a study done in UCLA that indicated that upwards of 93% of communication is determined actually by non-verbal cues. So that's pretty interesting. Another study indicated that the impact of performance was determined 7% by the words that were used, but 38% for nonverbal cues or quality of voice. Okay, so the types of communication that were nonverbal. So it's really kind of interesting. When it comes to storytelling, it's more about how your story is told than what the story is about that creates the interest. Somebody said in the response to me when I said what makes stories interesting, said suspense, and that is correct. But the reality is that any story can be interesting or boring depending on how it is told. Now, a few moments ago, I told you a story about pretty much nothing, right? I told you a story about um, how I had this IRS document that had to get in. It was really a story about nothing. I mean, I'm sure that that you've had 100 such circumstances in your life where there was something on deadline that, you had to get in and you panicked, to be able to get it in at the last moment. And so that story was really a story about nothing, yet it was kind of interesting, wasn't it? Because of how the story was told, not what the story is about. So when I say it's interesting, it may not be interesting in that the content is interesting, but I wonder how many of you are interested to know what happened. Was I able to get to the post office on time? Did I find my wallet? Was it stolen? What did I do without a driver's license, without credit cards, without a way to get into the bank? Okay. And so, you know, are you interested? I wonder. So sometimes we can tell it. Yes, everybody wants to know. All right. To be continued. But the point is that it really was a story about just an everyday event, not that it was about something that was so interesting. And we can do that by changing how we tell the story. So let's talk a little bit about that. Most people tell a story from the beginning to the middle to the end in a very linear way. And the problem with that strategy is that often by the time you get to the climax of the story, you've lost people's attention or it's just not that interesting anymore. So if you've ever been in the middle of the story and lost people's attention, most likely it's because of the structure of how you told that story. Probably told it in a linear way. A better way to start a story is at a point of high drama. So when I'm talking about a story, it can be a story, a metaphor, it can be, and it can be just a little story, it can be a long story or a short story. But when I was using that as an example, and I told you about waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning and um, I opened my eyes, I heard this alarm in my head and my adrenaline was pumping, right? So I was starting that story at a place of high drama. I mean, it's not a very dramatic story, but I started it at this place of high drama where you could feel my feelings a little bit as to what that must have felt like, or because you could relate to it. And so if you see the arrow in front of you, it's not right at the peak of the story necessarily, but right before the peak. Sometimes you can't start at the peak because the very top, because you have to give people a framework, otherwise they're not going to know what happens. So you start at a point of high drama where you're relating your feelings, where you're telling them what happened, and that way people are drawn in, so that even if you get interrupted, I've done some things, I've told some stories sometimes in talks, and we're going to talk about loops a little bit later, but where I'll leave loops open, because it's not a bad, you don't always have to close your loops when you start to tell a story. You don't always have to finish the story, because it keeps people in a natural state of curiosity. It keeps them unconsciously listening for what's coming next, because they want to hear the ending. So that's how we're naturally geared as human beings. We want conclusions. We want to see what happens at the end. So, so you want to start your story at a place of high drama, and this applies even if you're writing a blog post or an article. And you don't want to tell people how the situation was resolved or the end until the details are filled in. And that's what keeps people in a state of suspense, even if it's not a terribly suspenseful situation. I mean, what's the worst thing that could have happened to me? So I didn't have, maybe I wouldn't have had money, for a few days, and I would have, had to get a new driver's license, So all those things, it's not like I was going to die, in that situation. So, but the story is suspenseful to the point it can be, because I'm not filling in the details about what happened until the very end. So I'm sort of like spoiling it because I'm deconstructing what I'm doing, but I think that you can all get the gist. Okay. So, in between, as we're telling the story, you can add suspense with detail, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic detail. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then pacing. When you speak in quick, short sentences, you speed up the process, you speed up the pace, and then you can also pause to create more suspense and ask questions. And I think that most of you probably are aware that I was asking you those questions as we were going through. Has anything like that happened to you? What was I going to do? So those are the kinds of things that you can do to bring the level of suspense up in any metaphor or any example or something like that where you're trying to make a point about something. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. But even people, speakers that I see on a regular basis that are very familiar with VAK, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, I still hear them speak and they don't include that language in their presentation. So this is one of the tweaks that for those of you who are, have your presentations done, go back through those talks and make sure that you have visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language to be able to relate to people who don't uh, process information the same way as you. So, just very quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, there are some people whose internal processes are mainly visual, meaning that they see things like in their mind as they're processing information. It is a visual way of processing. And so they need to see something to remember it. And they, tend to use language or resonate with language like and let me go back through my what I had said to you earlier, and I'll use this as an example. I said I woke up with a flash. So a flash is something visual, so that was a visual thing, so that people who are visual would be engaged in what I was saying. And then I said an alarm went off in my head, right? So that would get the auditory people, their senses would be engaged with that auditory language, meaning what you hear. So visual is what you see, auditory is what you hear, and kinesthetic is what you feel. And I told you that I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my body. Now, I tend to be a very auditory person. So if I was just speaking in language that was natural to me, I wouldn't necessarily be saying all those things. I would just be speaking naturally in mainly auditory language. So, what you want to make sure, I mean, mainly talking about, oh, I could, how does that sound? That would be such a natural thing that I would say, well, how does that sound to you? But a visual person would say, how does that look to you? A kinesthetic person would say, how does that feel to you? And we're all talking about the same thing, but we're resonating with only one type of person when we're speaking in that way. And typically, we only speak in the way that's natural to us. And that is why we naturally turn off about 60% of the room, because they're not listening to us, because they're only listening for the cues that resonate with them. Okay, now there are some verbs, or there are some types of language where it could go either way. When you say, have you considered? So have you considered is not necessarily a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, but take note, that can be both visual, and uh, it can be kinesthetic too, because somebody could think about taking a note. Okay, so those are just some ideas. I know that most of you probably have done some training in visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. If you've done any kinds of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming at all, that's pretty much the first thing that you learn. But you just want to go through and make sure, especially in your opening story, in like I mean I'm doing 3 lots of presentations in a week and a half here for you that are all new. Obviously, I've taught a lot of this material in other formats before, but I had to pull these presentations together very quickly for you, so I didn't have a lot of time to do rehearsing on anything really. But where I do spend a little bit of time when I do these kinds of presentations on the fly is in the beginning, how I'm going to open, just to make sure that I'm going to hit some of these techniques that we're talking about here, so that you'll be able to resonate, that the majority of people will be able to hear what I'm saying and be open to the information that I'm going to present. So with pacing, you want to vary the speed at which you're speaking, and that helps you create more suspense. As I said before, short, crisp sentences move the pace of the speech faster, and you can slow things down by asking questions and pausing in between. And so you might be telling a story about being looking for somebody and you couldn't find them. And now maybe the next thing is that you found them, but you want to pause there and you want to go, so I wondered, were they trapped? Was I going to be the only survivor? You can see how that builds suspense. Now, if you think that you're good at pausing, because it sounds easy, what I'm going to ask you to do is to try asking somebody a difficult question and just waiting for the answer without saying anything, without saying a word. Have you noticed how most people, when they ask a question and it's a difficult question, they'll come in to rescue you, right? They'll come in and they'll interrupt and they'll start to speak more. It's because they're uncomfortable with the pause. But when you pause and people are listening on the other side, they're going in and they're going into their minds, into their feelings. And it gives them in that silence an opportunity to have an experience that they may not be able to have without the pause. So that's the kind of thing that you want to practice. And I know, like, in a lot of the times within our mastermind groups, what we do is when somebody does that, we give them feedback. Like, did you pause long enough? Was it too long? And you kind of get into a rhythm where it's really helpful, because when you're speaking, you don't necessarily know how other people are understanding, perceiving, relating to what it is that you're saying. And so when you have a group of people giving you feedback, sometimes you'll go, wow, that was so clear to me. How come they didn't understand it? Well, maybe you weren't speaking in language that resonated with them, because you're speaking only in your own language and not in the way they process information. So getting feedback and practicing with your pauses, practicing with your pacing, the only way you can really get good at that is not by doing it in your living room on your own, but by practicing in front of people. The more you talk, the better the better you're going to get, and the more you get feedback, the better you're going to get, and also the more open you are to that feedback. Because if you're not open, obviously, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, so as I mentioned, the questions in storytelling, here's just a few of them. Was I lost? What was he doing here? And then you can say the nagging question for me was, I thought, what if? Okay, so I wondered, how did that help me? Can you imagine? What would you do in a situation like that? Have you been in a situation like that? So those are all ways that you can create suspense in your stories by just adding a question or two within your story. Pausing. A pregnant pause is a pause that builds up suspense in the listener or viewer for a greater dramatic effect of what follows after the pause. I just had to put this in because I found this picture and I just thought it was so interesting. So it was this pregnant woman in front of, because that's like one of the times when you really think about pausing is when you're at a train and those doors are about to open. And I just love this picture. So I made this slide just because I like that picture. But anyway, Okay, so let me move on. Let's talk a little bit about open and nested loops. How many of you are familiar or use loops in your presentation? And how many of you don't have any idea what a loop really is? Help me, not familiar, all right? You familiar with it? You use it a little bit, you don't have any idea. Most of you have no idea. Okay, great, great. All right, so an open and nested loop is well, there's two. There's a nested loop is several open loops. Okay, and so I'm just going to talk about open loops right now. An open loop is what I did a little earlier when I was telling you a story and I didn't finish it. That's an open loop, or starting a metaphor and not finishing it, not completing it, going off in another direction and not and leaving you sort of in suspense about what's going to happen next. Okay, so that is an open loop. It keeps the audience in a state of anticipation, and because a state of learning, what you want to do to get people into a state of openness is to get them into a state of curiosity. Curiosity is the best um, state that you want to get your audience into. Okay, so write that down. Now, I want to get my audience into a state of curiosity. That's the place, because that's where people really learn. That's when they're most open. Okay. And so think about it this way. How with the place that you want to get people to is like when you were little, possibly, and your parents, if they did, have Christmas and or had some kind of a thing, and you would wonder, you could see those packages all wrapped up and looking so beautiful, and you were just dying to know what was inside those packages. And there's a lot of ways to get people into a state of curiosity. An open loop is a wonderful way to sort of start something and get people into that state of curiosity, because now they're open and they're listening for what you have next. So if you just think about a loop, a closed loop, we all know what that looks like. An open loop is just that the story doesn't have an ending yet. Now, usually you'll close the loops at the end of the presentation, the end of the story, but you won't close it right away. Does that make sense? Everybody know what a loop is right now, an open loop. If anybody is unsure, please let me know. Okay, so here's an example. Um, I had gone to visit my friends up in Minnesota, and we were out walking on this frozen lake, and they had gone way ahead in front of me, and I was taking pictures with my phone and having a great time, even though it was really cold. And all of a sudden I heard a crack, and I looked down, and I could see that I was standing on thin ice, and the ice was cracking all around me. Now, the way I ended up being in Minnesota with my friends, and now I'm starting to talk about my friends in Minnesota, and I'm going to talk about blah, blah, blah for whatever reason. Now, you only tell a story if it has a point that you're trying to make. You don't tell a story just for the sake of storytelling. You always want to make sure that anything that you're telling either has a metaphor associated with it that you're going to use as a way for people to remember what it is, the point you're trying to make. But you don't just throw in a story for the sake of doing a story. I'm doing this right now with this thin ice underneath my feet, only for the purpose of showing you what an open loop is. So there we go. I opened that loop through the story, and I didn't finish telling you. Now you're in a state of suspense. You don't know what happened to me or that person, whoever it is that's standing on the ice. And by the way, that's just a piece of uh, clip art. It's not my, those are not my feet. I was just making up that story. Um, but that's how you open a loop. You start a story or you start a metaphor and off you go, and then you get into something else. When I opened the loop about the IRS thing earlier, I then opened another loop about my wallet being missing. Okay, I opened another loop about doing something else. I forget, but I talked about, I think, the gas. Okay, so I opened a bunch of loops there for you. I nested some loops, and that's what basically nesting is. Nesting is taking a bunch of loops and opening them one after the other. So a nested loop is like a nesting balls or nesting doll. You begin to tell a story, and then without ending the story about the IRS, I opened the story about running, almost not having gas, and then I opened another story, another loop, about my wallet. Okay, and then I opened another loop about the piggy bank. Okay, and then I, inside of those things, I told you certain things that I wanted to make a point about. I didn't tell you any of those stories, though all of them are true. I wouldn't have used those examples had they not been able to deliver my points. Typically, when I go into a presentation, depending on what the environment is like, I'll often use actual things that happened to me recently, in the past few days or weeks, and I'll pull some examples to create my loops, because I find that I'm more fresh and interesting and authentic when I have something that's not sort of over rehearsed and over prepared in this kind of an environment, than having the same thing that I say each time. But that's just my style. My style is to be fresh and authentic, and I don't care that much if I and on say things that a Toastmaster would just freak out about, because that's not who I am. I'm, I like to be able to take things that happen on a day-to-day basis and use them to make certain points. Okay, so for example, in the IRS story, I was using that to the IRS form to make the point that often we think that people aren't listening to us, or people aren't getting what we're saying because it's obviously not important to them. I think people do that, especially with their spouses or kids. We think that people aren't paying enough attention, and that's why they didn't remember, when in fact, that's not necessarily true. And when um, you'll see why I made those other points about the other things. When I made the point about the piggy bank, I was wanting to make the point about putting these techniques, these skills, this learning into your resources, internal resources, so that you can pull from them at all times, so that they collect and they gather and they have value, even though while you're learning them or practicing them, you may not realize how much you may need that down the road. So in order for me to be able to make those points, I said those metaphors, because those metaphors are the things that make speech more interesting, but also it becomes easier for people to grasp and learn and realize. Okay. So with nested loops, you start to tell a story, then without ending, you tell another story, and then without ending, you tell another story. And you can do this many times. Now, for anybody who's done hypnosis, this is taught in hypnosis. These are sort of hypnotic language patterns, and so to put somebody into a hypnotic trance, using nested loops is a very good strategy, because what hypnosis is a state of focus where people's focus are directed into a certain area, and that's all you're doing. You're getting them into a hyper attentive state where they're just focused on one particular area. And so nested loops are like little spirals that take people down into a story. You close the loops by working backward and putting an end to each story. Okay. And so the loops don't need to be big or long. They're just you can just start a loop just like I did. It was just a few minutes that I told all those beginning. I opened those loops in probably less than 2 minutes. Okay. And I can close them in less than 2 minutes. So if you look at the slide in front of you, you'll see that my open loops were the IRS forms, the wallet, and the piggy bank. Now, I did open some other loops as well, but those are the ones I just wanted to show you. So when I close those loops, I'll close the piggy bank, the wallet, and the IRS form in that order. So you go, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Okay. And that basically, if you think about it metaphorically, creates an open file in somebody's mind. So you open up a folder and then you put the information in, and then it sits nicely in a closed folder when you close the loops. And you do not need to close all the loops. It's not necessary. So, from a storytelling, for storytelling, here are the things that I like to use. I start near the high point, and again, take notes if you're not already doing that. Start near the high point. Use visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language. Engage with questions. Vary the pace and use pausing, and use loops. Use open and close loops. So if you're reasonably new, again, do your structure first, then you can go back into your story and make it more interesting. If you already have a pretty interesting story, go in and see if you can tweak it by starting it at a more interesting point, a place of high drama. Look at what you're saying. Do you have enough visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language? Are you hitting all those different kinds of people? Can you pause here and there to add a question? And you shouldn't overdo any of these things. You just don't, less is more, but it's very, very powerful stuff. And then make sure you've worked with your pauses, that you're taking long enough pauses in between to, you want people to sort of move forward on their seats to want to hear what it is you're going to say next. Okay. Now, with those stories, you have engagement. Okay, people are interested in what you want to say. Your next step is to influence and motivate them. Okay, are you ready for some advanced influence and motivation skills? Okay. As I mentioned when I was talking about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, most people naturally speak only to people with similar styles and traits. But if you want to capture, let's say, more of the people that you're already speaking to, if you want to broaden your audience by consciously reaching more of the people you are already in front of, then these skills are for you, because you can either go and get new people or you can try to get more of the people that you're speaking to. Obviously, we want all of that, yeah? But we want to be able to get more of the people that we're speaking to in the room not only engaged, but then at a place where we can influence them, at a place where they're motivated to actually take action in the direction we want to lead. Okay, so your influenceability equals flexibility. And what I mean by that is basically going back to the point that I said a little earlier. Most people are only effective in influencing people with similar styles to them. But the more flexible you are in your language, in your presentation, the more influential you become. And the more you practice flexibility, the more flexible you become. It's like yoga. How many of you do yoga? I love yoga. I do yoga 4 or 5 times a week. And the more the more I practice, I'm in my mid 50s and I get more and more flexible. It's amazing to me that even at this age, I still get more and more flexibility. Now, I know that ultimately there's probably going to come a time when that gets a little harder, but it's just amazing how much flexibility you can have when you start. When you first start, it's hard. So, for those of you who've recently taken up yoga, it's hard when you first start. But as you practice and you practice, it gets easier and easier, and you get more flexible. And then, as you learn a new thing or a new posture that you haven't done before, even that seems a lot easier than what it does to a beginner. Why? Because your body is used to going to its limits and then stretching, and then taking it. And just like with yoga, as you practice these techniques, you want to be able to breathe into them and not force too much, right? So you want to be able to um, learn something and then keep on repeating it and being easy with yourself and not trying to just jam everything into it, but doing it piece by piece, practicing, getting feedback, and incorporating it in step by step. You can't go to the most advanced posture and all the most advanced postures if you're just beginning. You're not able to, you don't have that flexibility. I mean, it's not that you're not able to ever, it's just today. That's not where you're at. So know where you're at and honor that, wherever that is, and know that wherever that is, there's a little bit more you can go, a little bit more you can learn, a little bit more you can incorporate into your presentations and into your talks, and make it become more and more and more of a skilled professional communicator. Okay. Um, let's see. Uh, let's talk a little bit about styles and traits. Let's first talk. I'm going to just touch on learning styles. Some of you may already know some of this. I'm just going to touch on learning styles because this is probably more important for uh, teaching than what it is for just a short presentation, a signature talk, although it does capture people's attention. So there's something called the format, which is a highly validated and renowned learning and communication tool. And just breaking it down very briefly, format teaches us that 35% of people are sorting for why. These are people that want to know the reason behind why they're doing something. In order to learn something, they need to understand why before they'll be open to learning. 22% of people are more interested in what it is they're going to learn. Now, keep in mind, you're going to be teaching them the same thing. It's just this is what their brains. Remember when we talked about people are sorting internally for different types of information? People are processing 400 billion bits of information per second. And as an efficiency strategy, your brain automatically deletes, distorts, and generalizes most of the information in accordance with your beliefs and experiences. It decides what it's going to do, what it's going to bring to your attention, and what it's going to process and just generalize and put into your sort of general memory bank, and what it's going to just delete or throw out, or what it's going to say, oh, well, this is something like such and such a thing, and so it can distort information. So the reason that we look at these different styles or traits of people is to understand what people are naturally sorting for, so that your language, because that's what you have to communicate with, in addition to your style and your pausing and whatever. I mean, we are communicating with language. We need to hit on these aspects. So the what people are interested in, the outcomes or what it is that you're going to be speaking about, how people want to know how it happened, or how to do it, or how to accomplish it. And the what if people, which are 25%, are sorting for ways that they can apply this information in other ways. They're interested in possibilities. So, just to kind of recap how I applied this in my presentation today, when I began, um, you have to give people a frame, okay? So when we began, I talked about um, today I think I said something like, today we're going to focus on tweaks to your presentation. So that was what, so that you can get better results, so that you can cut through distraction. So there I had the what and I had the why. Okay. And then I also went in later to the what when I said, I'm going to give you five, we're going to cover these five strategies, these five areas. Okay. Now, and as I was going through and talking to you about those five areas, I also talked to you about that we're going to learn how to use them. And so that resonated with the how people. And I also told you that you can use this information to apply to other areas, to other forms of communication, to using it with your spouse or your kids or your clients. So that would get those what if people. Okay. So, what if people are the ones that are looking for possibilities? They're looking for other ways they can apply it. So that is how you reach all those people. But the reason that I bring this up, because it seems so natural and easy, the problem is that most people are only um, looking at their presentation from their point of view, what resonates with them. And that's the reason that you want to be sure. You just go back and make sure, am I resonating with the why people? Do I have enough reasons why they need to listen? Have I described what it is we're going to do? Am I giving the how people some meat, to hold on to? And imagine the possibilities for those what if people. And we get all of those learning styles by simply doing that, grabbing their attention in that way. When it comes to actually moving people to action, there are actually about 6 motivation traits that people have. And if you're interested in learning more about this work, I would suggest either Roger Bailey or Shelley Rose Chavez' work. And what I'm just going to be talking about a couple of motivation traits or whatever we have time for here. But every type of motivation trait, when we talk about this, I want you to keep in mind that they're very context specific, meaning that what might be a motivational trait, I might act one way when it comes to my job or my career, but I might act another way. I may act a different way when it comes to my primary relationship, and yet even another way when it comes to a relationship with a friend or with a kid or something else. So it's very important not to generalize what I'm going to talk to you about right now, but to make sure that, especially when you're speaking to people, that you don't assume that they're a certain way. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of motivational traits that will help you move people to action. And these 2 traits that I'm going to talk about today are ones that are very easy to incorporate in a talk or a speech or a presentation. And all of them are very easy to do when you're speaking to people one-on-one, but these are especially important when you're speaking one to many, or when you're writing, your descriptions of your talks, or you're putting together a positioning statement or a bio or anything like that. So the first motivation trait I want to discuss today is motivational direction. There are some people that are motivated by moving toward a goal, and other people that are motivated by moving away from a problem. Now, I know that some people think that this is either positive or negative motivation, and I want you to wipe that idea from your mind because this is just the way people sort information. And so what's happened is that people who are naturally tend to be problem solvers, which we need a lot in our society, have been labeled as being negative. And that is just not necessarily true or fair. Um, there are some people that are just naturally, in a specific context, drawn to solving problems much more so than they are to accomplishing a goal. And so we just want to think about them as being different from other people, those two types in any context from being different, and not label people as positive or negative, right or wrong, because it's just different. Okay. So, um, so a person who is motivated toward a goal, you may remember that when I began this presentation, I talked about our goals. I even had a little target. And for those goal-oriented people, that made them very happy because they felt like they were going to get, we were setting a goal for something that we wanted to do. And people who are really goal-oriented like to have goals. But then I also talked about the problem that we're going to solve today. And I talked about how people are so distracted. And so for the problem solving people, which are called away from in motivational traits, so those away from people were felt that they were going to get satisfied because they were going to solve a problem that existed. And so in your email communication, in your flyers, on your website, in your emails, whatever it is, you need to realize that some people are going to be interested in solving a problem, and you're going to give the exact same information to both these people, but it's just the way you're framing it, the way you're saying it. Those people they're attracted to that language. You're never going to move an away from person to action with toward language, and you're never going to get a toward person, a goal oriented person, to buy something that you have to offer with away from language. They're not interested in solving a problem. It's not that they're not interested in the problem, but the way their minds work is they're interested in what the future is, what they're going toward, not what they're moving away from. So if you think about, let's just say in the context of relationships, I know that some of you are relationship coaches, and I'm going to use this just as an example because everybody's been in a relationship. So it's something we can all relate to. So if you think about a relationship that broke up or that you broke up, um, either for some people, in order to break up in a relationship, to actually break off a relationship, the relationship has to get really bad. It has to just be where they have to get away from that relationship. And until that relationship gets really, really bad, they're not going to make that move. Whereas other people are going to need to have something to go toward. So until they either have another relationship or the idea of another relationship, the thought of another relationship that's strong enough, they're never going to get out of that relationship. In order to move to that other thing, they need something to move toward. And typically, what we do, just like with the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, we try to motivate other people to do things the way we're motivated. And some people, in fact, in the context of work, I think I have a slide here that talks about that. Yeah. In the context of work, 40% of people are motivated toward, 40% of people are motivated away from, and there's only the 20% in the middle that have both equal amounts of toward and away from. So, in order to get somebody to want to engage in a presentation or in a product or whatever, we want to make sure that we have language that resonates with both toward and away from language. So, this is basic NLP meta programs. This is this comes out of the field of neurolinguistic programming. Tony Robbins took that information. For those of you who've done Tony Robbins, he took what was not his work, and there was a big lawsuit over it. But he turned that same information and he talked about it as moving away from pain or pleasure, is how he described it. So, if you have a frame of reference from either of those two sets of information, those two libraries, if you would, you can just build on that and just be really aware that this is a very important strategy that you need to understand both in your working with clients and in your presentation, that there are that people are a mixture between these things, and so you need to make sure that you're talking to people about solving if you're especially if you tend to be a very goal oriented person, you want to make sure you're also adding the solving of the problem into your language. And if you tend to be a problem solver, you want to talk to people about outcomes, about goals, about things they're going to achieve, obtain, the benefits, the advantages. And so you might want to make note of some of these language, these actual verbs, or these actual words for toward, that would attract toward people: a goal, attain, obtain, the advantages. This is what you're going to get. Okay, so those are achieve. That's another good toward word. And then away from is where you'll talk about you won't have to. This is the problem we're going to solve. This is what you can get rid of. This is what you can avoid. You won't have to deal with whatever it is. So make sure you've got both in your presentation. Okay? And as I said, it's not negative or positive, just different. Very important. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, the next motivation trait I want to talk about, is one called reason. Okay, and it's not the way we think of the word reason, but it's the reason when you say to somebody why. I think the reason that they call it reason is the way you find out if somebody is either an options or procedures person in a specific context, is you ask them a why question. So if I think about what your answer would be, if I said, why did you choose to come to this, why did you come to this presentation today? Why did you come to this presentation today? And just kind of make a note for how you're answering it. Make a note just how you would exactly answer it. Don't get intellectual about it. Just whatever comes to mind, make a note. Now, for some of you, you may have, when I asked that question, you may have said something like, I wanted to learn how to improve my presentation. I wanted to learn how to be a better speaker. I wanted to solve, I hate it when people don't listen to me, and I wanted to figure out how to cut through distraction. Okay. So if you said that kind of a thing, any of you that said that, you would also be able to see based on how you answered that, if it was something you wanted to avoid or something that you were moving toward, you would be able to tell what your motivational strategy is in terms of direction. Do you move toward a goal or do you solve a problem? Is that how are you motivated? Um, but other people who may have answered this question were may have thought about something along these lines. Well, I didn't really have that much to do today, and I got Mandy's email, so I thought I would just check in and see if it would be of interest to me. Something along that line. Or I'm a new member at Free Speaker Bureau and I wanted to see what Mandy had to offer. So that would sort of be a story, right? Those people are what are considered procedures people in this context, meaning that their brain sorts information based on process, based on how it came to be. Now, the reality is that we're all getting the same information, just how we ended up here. One is based on criteria that maybe the information sounded like it would be interesting, they would learn something, they'd be able to, get rid of a problem that they're facing. And the other group of people think about things in a more procedural way, a way of what the story is, how it came to be. Okay. And again, neither of those ways are right or wrong, they're just different. But options people are the people that answered the question with criteria. I thought I would learn, I would be able to improve my presentation, I would be able to come through distraction. They answered that question with specific criteria as to why. The procedures people are interested in how more than why. Okay. And options people are motivated to do things in different ways. They like choices, they like breaking rules. They can sometimes have difficulty making decisions because they just see a whole lot of options, and sometimes it's hard for them to pick one. Okay, but they love options. They like to create processes, but they're not very good at following processes. So I'm a very high options person in most areas, not in all areas, not in all contexts, but I'm very much an options person. I like to do things differently. I like to create these new learning experiences for my speakers instead of doing the same ones over and over again. I like to lots of possibilities. Okay. That's my personality trait. That's my motivation trait in this context. I may not be that way in everything. I do not like to get a new car or a new cell phone because I'm not an options person. I want to have the same thing. I know how to do it. I don't want to learn a new way. I don't want to see what the possibilities are. I don't want to know what are the features that I'm not using now. I couldn't care less because in that context, I am procedure. I'd like to just do what I know to do there. I'm not interested in all those other options. Okay. So we change depending on the context that it's in. And in your talk, in your presentation, you want to make sure that when you're making an offer specifically, that you give both options and procedures people an opportunity to be able um, to buy from you, to be able to sort in your direction. Okay. So options people need a choice. Procedures people need to know the right way. I don't know, you may look at my email that I sent out this morning, and I think I said something like, today I'm going to break the rules again. That is music to an options person's ears. They love to know that they're going to break the rules. They want to break the rules. Okay. But I said, and I'm going to show you the right way to motivate people. The procedures people like to know the right way. They want to do things right. Now, it's not that options people don't want to do things right. It's just that that's not music to their ears. It's not what attracts them. They like to color outside the lines. They want to know what if. Okay. And we change depending on the context. So those are things you want to do. So when you're, for example, giving people an option, let's just say in an offer that you're making, you want to, so you want to give them an option, but you also want to tell those procedure people what the right way is. So if you remember when I started talking to you about that I was going to tweak those presentations, we were going to tweak our presentation. For those of you who already had your presentations, but for those people who are brand new, what you want to do is this way. This is the right way to do it. Now, we have a tendency when we're starting something new to tend to be more procedural. Okay, not always, but mainly, and we want to know what the right way is. And so I made sure that that I put that in right in the beginning, because I didn't want to overwhelm the procedures people, because procedures people like to have a certain process. They like to go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. They don't want like all these different options to be able to just pick and choose from. It drives them crazy. Okay, so I want to be able to speak to all of you, and that's why I made sure that I give you that frame right in the beginning. So when you want to attract procedures people, you want to tell them how. You want to show them what the rules are, what the sequence is. So for some of you who are procedural in your storytelling, it may have been very hard for you to hear. It may be very difficult for you the first or second time when you tell a story not to start at the beginning. Okay, it may be you may get challenged by that, so you may have to lay out your story beginning, middle, end, and then go to the middle and pull that up and then see. So let me tell you how that came to be, and then you go back to that place. Again, there's no right or wrong, it's just different. Procedure people like to finish things, they love completion. Options people don't care about finishing. I can be reading 20 or 30 books at any one time, and I don't feel compelled to finish any of them. And for a procedure person when it comes to reading, that would drive them crazy. Okay. So what the important point behind this is to recognize, and again, it's context specific, right? So please remember that. Don't generalize, and don't generalize for yourself and generalize for other people. But what you want to realize is that um, other people are not necessarily like us. So we need to make sure that when we're presenting to other people that we are honoring everybody that's in the room. And just because they're different or they sort differently from us doesn't mean that we want to have them checking their cell phones. It doesn't mean that we want them to go to some other place in their mind where maybe they're looking at you, but they're not listening to a word you're saying, because your language hasn't um, grasped them, hasn't put them, you haven't gone to their bus station and invited them on the bus with you. So this is a great, I don't know if you remember this, and I haven't heard this in a long time. I'm not sure, I haven't seen any Outback ads in a long time, but when it comes to options and procedures, this ad for Outback Steakhouse is a great way to get both options and procedures people. And that was their slogan: no rules, just right. Okay, so no rules will get the options people interested. We don't want any rules, but the procedures people in that context, when it comes to eating or eating out, they want it just right. Okay. So again, options people are interested in choices. They're interested in breaking the rules. They're interested in possibilities, opportunities, as far as words are concerned. So I'm speaking really specifically here about language patterns. It's not necessarily that people are that different in the things that they want. It's what language. Here, remember we talked about flexibility of language, yoga, the yoga of language, right? So it's using these flexible language patterns to be able to respond to different people and to be able to attract different people that you're speaking to. Procedures people are interested in the how more than the why, and they want to know, what are the next steps? How do we finish this? What's going on? So some of you who had attended last week, to last week's program may have felt compelled to want to do the next one because this was the next in the series. Others of you who tend to be more options couldn't have cared less. Maybe that one interested you and this one didn't, or vice versa. You wanted to be able to pick and choose whatever it was that you wanted. But remember that your audience has, is probably 40 on the one side, 40 on the other side, and 20 in the middle that respond to both. So we want to be able to get all those language patterns included. Okay, so I've given you a lot of information today. I hope you've taken a lot of notes and that you've learned something from what we've presented. Sometimes it's a little challenging because we have people of all different kinds of experience and different education. So I hope that you are able to get something out of today. And what I'd like to ask you is, what are the strategies that you want to implement that you find most appealing, given where you're at, given what your experience level is? What do you want to improve most? So do you want to work on your stories? How many of you want to work on your stories? So you can just send me a yes in your chat. Okay, good. Okay, how many of you want to begin using loops or want to improve the use of loops? Okay, great. And how many of you are wanting to improve the flexibility of your language patterns? All right, so how many want to work on visual, auditory, and kinesthetic? Okay, and how many want to work on some of this motivational language? Now, the motivational language, again, if you're really interested in this, I'd like to see a sort of, if you're interested in learning more about this is something that I've taught a lot over the years, motivational language, because I do a lot of coaches coaching. And so for coaches, this is really important, getting people motivated in the direction that they want internally, but you're not necessarily getting them to take action. So motivational language is really, I love this work. And so that's something that I do a lot of. So okay, so maybe that will be something that we'll work on in the future, because there's 6 other patterns that I haven't really gotten to mentioned yet today. And then how many of you are interested in incorporating the format, the 4 learning styles? Okay, great. So I want those of you who said yes to a lot. So I noticed that there are a few of you that just said yes to everything, right? And so I want you to please go through now and decide on just one area that you want to work on. And then you can think of a secondary and a third, because I don't want you to just, you need to work on something and then practice it and get it integrated. Otherwise, you'll learn all the stuff and you'll start integrating and you won't do any of them really well. And just one of these techniques or these tools integrated well can be better than, just all of them sort of half baked. Okay, Shannon, yeah, I know. I can see that you're an options person. So let's just say, so let me help you find the right way then to decide that. Think about where you feel that you can gain the most in your presentation. Really, the beginning of your presentation, there's the most important part of the presentation. The first most important part is the opening, and the second most important part is the closing. So if you think that you have a really strong opening already, then I would say begin working on the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic language patterns because those are going to be easiest to integrate into your story. But if you don't feel that your opening is as strong as it could be, then begin working on your opening story. And in your opening story, you begin by changing the structure of it, working on the pausing, working on the pace and the structure of that story where you start in the middle. So that's where I would begin. If you don't think you've got a great opening, begin with your opening. And typically the way you want to start your opening is typically you give a frame and you start to tell your story, whatever the story is. And please don't tell stories that have no bearing on what you, if they don't have a point. Don't tell a story unless it has a point. I see people doing that. Just because it's a good story doesn't mean you have to tell it. It needs to be making a point, or there's no point in telling the story. You don't have enough time in a presentation to just tell a story. Okay. So, and I want you to think about these skills like putting your spare change into, into a piggy bank. So if you just think about these things and you don't actually deposit them, it's not going to do you any good. When you come up empty or you lose your wallet or whatever, you won't have any deposits in your piggy bank. So think about the learning process and the application as actually depositing them in that piggy bank. And then, when the time comes, you've got plenty of money. Now, luckily, I was able to scrape together over $100 in just change that day when I needed money. It was amazing to me. I mean, to me, it was just like loose change. It was just a place to put my change. But I had over $100 in that bottle. I was just amazed. And it was really interesting because it turned out that my wallet wasn't actually lost or stolen. I had had people come the night before or 2 days before, and I'd had people come over, and I had cleaned up really quickly, and I had put my wallet somewhere in a safe place. And of course, it wasn't really lost. I'd put it in the spot that I'd forgotten about. So it turned out everything um, landed up being fine. So I bet some of you listening think, wow, she must have a really terrible memory. Either that or she's a real ditz. How many of you, come on, be honest, how many of you are thinking, oh my gosh, she forgot the IRS thing. She forgot, to put gas in her car. She forgot where her wallet was. So you're thinking, oh my gosh, just busy. Yeah. Well, I don't really have a very good memory, but how come is it that I'm able to do every single presentation without notes? Maybe a senior moment. Yeah. Okay. So in the next session, so we did the monetization piece last week. We talked about your messaging this week. So our next session next Wednesday is really about how to practice and remember. And as I mentioned to you when we began this, I did this Dharma talk the other day that was a brand new presentation without notes. It was a full half an hour that I spoke in a totally different environment that I'm used to speaking. I was actually sitting, I don't know, those of you who have been to a Zen group, everybody's sort of like sitting and sort of cross-legged around the room. And there's, it was about 30 people there, and we were all just sitting, which is very different to standing and delivering a presentation. And even with that, uh, I was able to do this brand new talk uh, without notes. And so I'm going to share with you my secrets next week for how I practice and how I go about remembering, and the little tricks that I use so that I basically have invisible notes that only I can see all over the room. So thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend. And I will see you next week. We will get you out this recording as soon as we can. Take care and Goodbye.